has seen its craft be refined so quickly by the rapid progress of technology over the last 150 years.
War is always deadly, but some jobs in World War II were almost a guaranteed death sentence.
Then the 20 millimeters will start rattling at him.
While frontline soldiers faced constant danger, there were other roles even worse, where survival was nearly impossible. These jobs had sky-high fatality rates, pushing men into the worst and most horrifying situations of the war. Starting with the B-17 bomber crews, or ball turret gunners, also known as flying coffins. They faced deadly missions in the skies during wartime. Flying high over enemy territory, the B-17 Flying Fortress was a powerful bomber used by the United States Army Air Forces during World War II. Its mission was clear: strike at key enemy targets like factories and military bases. The aircraft was built to take damage and keep going, but for the men inside, survival was never guaranteed. Every mission was a deadly gamble, and no crew member had it worse than the ball turret gunner. The ball turret was a small, round glass pod attached to the belly of the plane. Inside, a gunner squeezed into the tiny space, curled up with his knees to his chest. There was no room for a parachute. If the plane was hit, there was no escape. The turret's thin armor barely protected him from enemy fire, making him an easy target for attacking fighter planes. He controlled 2.50 caliber machine guns, and because of their firepower, enemy pilots aimed straight for him. If he died, the bomber lost one of its best defenses. If the landing gear failed, the turret would hit the ground first, crushing the gunner inside. The dangers didn't stop at enemy fire. B-17 bombers flew at altitudes of 35,000 feet, where temperatures dropped below freezing. The ball turret was fully exposed to the icy wind. Oxygen lines could freeze, making it hard to breathe. Frostbite was common, and gunners had to keep their fingers moving just to fire their weapons. They needed to stay sharp, tracking enemy planes speeding through the sky, ready to strike at any moment. There was no room for mistakes. 1 second too slow, and it was over. The odds of survival were terrifying. American bomber crews had to complete between 25 and 30 missions before they could go home. But with nearly half of all crews never making it back, reaching that number was almost impossible. British bombers faced similar dangers, launching air raids over Nazi-occupied Europe night after night. Bombing was the fastest way to strike deep into enemy territory, but for those in the sky, every mission was a fight to survive. Some made it back. Many did not. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.
Anxious and willing to learn to pilot a ship, operate a bomb site, or plot a mission over enemy territory.
If flying coffins faced a terrible time, the U.S. Army Air Corps bomber crew fought alongside them, risking everything on each flight. Flying as a bomber crew member in World War II was one of the most dangerous jobs anyone could have. These men were sent high into the sky, deep into enemy territory, with no guarantee they would make it back. Their mission was to drop bombs on enemy targets, fortified positions, supply depots, and railroad yards, but getting there and back was a nightmare. Bombers flew in tight formations to defend each other, but that also made them easy targets. Enemy anti-aircraft guns on the ground fired flak, filling the sky with deadly metal shards that could rip through a plane like paper. If a bomber was hit and caught fire, there was little hope. Parachuting out over enemy territory meant capture, or worse. At first, these bombers had no fighter support, making them even more vulnerable. German fighters could easily spot them, soaring up through the clouds to strike from all directions. Their goal was simple: break up the formation, isolate a plane, and take it down. If the formation collapsed, it was a death sentence. Inside the plane, the crew did everything they could to fight back. Waist gunners stood at open windows, braving freezing winds to shoot at incoming fighters. A single mistake, losing a glove or taking off an oxygen mask, could lead to frostbite or unconsciousness within seconds. At such high altitudes, the air was thin, the temperatures brutal, and death could come from the elements as easily as from the enemy. Even when crews survived an attack, their bombers were often left damaged. Struggling to stay in the air, making it back to base was never certain. Some crashed into the sea, some limped home with engines barely working, and others simply vanished. The odds were terrifying. In 1944, an 8th Air Force bomber crew member had a life expectancy of just 15 missions, but they were required to complete 25. In the early days, only 30% finished their full tour alive. One group, the 100th Bomb Group, was hit so hard it earned the nickname the Bloody 100th. They kept going because they had no choice. Every mission was a gamble with death. As bombers roared above, beneath the ocean's surface, the German U-boat crew, called Silent Death, moved like shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Serving on a German U-boat during World War II was one of the worst jobs imaginable. These submarines were supposed to be silent killers, sneaking through the ocean to ambush enemy ships. But life on board was nothing short of a nightmare. Cramped, damp, and reeking of diesel fuel, the inside of a U-boat felt like a floating coffin. Dozens of men, packed into tight spaces, with no privacy, no fresh air, and barely enough food to last their patrols. They slept in shifts, sharing bunks that never truly felt their own. Days blurred together in darkness, the only light coming from dim bulbs or the occasional beam of the periscope. At first, U-boats terrorized the Atlantic, sinking countless merchant ships and cutting off supplies to the Allies. They struck fast, disappearing before anyone could fight back, but their advantage didn't last. The British and Americans improved their radar and sonar, turning the hunters into the hunted. Now, every mission was a game of survival. When enemy ships detected a U-boat, they dropped depth charges, underwater bombs meant to destroy anything in their path. The explosions shook the submarine violently, sending men flying as pipes burst and bolts popped loose. If the water started rushing in, there was no escape. Either the sub would sink to the bottom, crushing everyone inside, or it would be forced to surface, where enemy ships and planes waited to finish the job. Even when the crew wasn't under attack, the conditions were brutal. No showers for weeks, no fresh food after the first few days, and a stench that never went away. The air was so thick with diesel fumes and sweat that breathing felt like swallowing poison. Food supplies were stored wherever there was space, sometimes even in the torpedo room. If something spoiled, there was no choice but to eat it anyway. The crew grew used to sickness, exhaustion, and the constant stress of knowing they could die at any moment. Some never even saw sunlight for weeks. They were trapped not just in a submarine, but in a war that was closing in on them. By 1943, U-boats were no longer feared. They were hunted relentlessly. Once an elite force, they became death traps. Fewer and fewer made it back to base. Those who did know it was only a matter of time before they weren't so lucky. There was no glory left, only a slow, suffocating doom beneath the waves. Well, on the battlefield, flamethrower operators, known as human torches, unleashed fire with devastating force. Imagine being sent to the front lines, not with a gun, but with a weapon that made you a walking target. Flamethrower operators had one of the worst, most dangerous jobs in World War II. The idea was simple: clear out enemy bunkers, trenches, and caves by unleashing a wave of fire. But in reality, carrying a giant tank of flammable liquid on your back in the middle of a war zone was like strapping explosives to yourself and hoping no one took a shot at you. The enemy knew that one bullet to the fuel tank could turn you into a human fireball. Even if that didn't happen, using the weapon meant standing up and making yourself visible, an easy mark for snipers. The heat, the weight, the terrifying risk, everything about this job was a nightmare. The United States military, despite being the last to develop flamethrowers in World War II, quickly became the most skilled at using them. The weapon was terrifying, but few stopped to think about how it really worked. Some American soldiers even believed that getting hit by a flamethrower was a quick and painless way to go. They called it a mercy killing because many enemy soldiers dropped dead without any visible burns. But the truth was far worse. Those caught in the flames didn't just die instantly, they suffocated as the fire sucked the oxygen from the air. Some were poisoned by carbon monoxide before the flames even reached them. The full horror of what the weapon did wasn't properly understood until years later, when scientists finally studied its effects in detail. At first, no one seemed interested in how flamethrowers actually killed. A 1944 military bulletin even stated that as long as the enemy died, the exact cause didn't matter. But as the war went on, things changed. The press described flamethrowers as inhumane, a weapon of terror. Reports surfaced of Japanese soldiers taking their own lives rather than facing one. The United States military had to respond. They started investigating, working with scientists and doctors to understand what happened when someone was hit by a flamethrower. Their studies revealed the horrifying truth. The weapon didn't just burn, it suffocated, poisoned, and destroyed its victims in ways more awful than anyone had imagined. The idea of it being a mercy weapon disappeared. It was one of the most brutal, feared, and dangerous tools of war, both for those who used it and those who faced it. Amid the flames of war, merchant mariners faced deadly waters, braving enemy attacks to keep vital supplies moving across the seas. During World War II, most people thought of soldiers, pilots, and Marines as the ones facing the most danger. But there was another group, often forgotten, who had one of the deadliest jobs of the war: the merchant mariners. They weren't part of the official military, but without them, victory would have been impossible. They sailed across deadly waters, bringing supplies from America to the battlefronts in Europe and the Pacific. Their ships carried everything: food, weapons, fuel, keeping the war machine running. But their job came with a terrible price. Enemy submarines lurked beneath the waves, waiting for the slow, heavy cargo ships to pass. Torpedoes struck without warning, tearing through metal and sending flames and smoke into the air. Planes swooped down, dropping bombs, turning the ocean into a graveyard. It wasn't a matter of luck. It was almost certain that if you sailed long enough, you would be attacked. Every week, an average of 33 merchant marine ships were lost. That's nearly 5 ships a day disappearing beneath the waves, leaving nothing behind but burning wreckage and desperate survivors in lifeboats, if they were lucky enough to escape. The odds of survival were grim. 1 out of every 26 mariners never made it home. Their fatality rate was 4%, higher than even the United States Marine Corps, which lost 3.6% of its men. And yet, their sacrifice was barely recognized. While soldiers on the front lines were hailed as heroes, these sailors fought their own war on the seas with little acknowledgement. They weren't given the same honors or benefits as other veterans, even though they suffered just as much, if not more. Imagine sailing through icy, dark waters, knowing at any moment a torpedo could hit, a mine could explode, or a plane could attack. There were no armored bunkers, no trenches, just open water and the hope that you wouldn't be next. Even if a ship wasn't directly hit, the brutal conditions, exhaustion, and constant fear made every journey a nightmare. And yet, despite it all, they kept sailing. Without them, the war couldn't have been won. They were the silent backbone of the war effort, and their sacrifice should never be forgotten. While others battled the seas, field telephone layers and radio teams risked their lives on the ground, keeping communication lines open under constant enemy fire. Keeping the front lines connected was a deadly job in World War II. Soldiers needed to send messages back and forth to command, but that wasn't as easy as pressing a button. It required laying telephone wires across dangerous battlefields, sometimes right in the middle of active fighting. Someone had to carry a spool of wire on their back, crawling through mud, ruins, and open fields while bullets flew overhead. If a line was cut, it had to be repaired, often while the enemy was watching. It was brutal work, and the soldiers who did it had little chance of making it through without being spotted. Enemy snipers had a clear priority: officers first, then anyone keeping the army running. That included the men laying communication lines and carrying radios. If you had a radio on your back or were holding a wire, you instantly became a high-value target. Every enemy soldier knew that, without communication, an army couldn't function. If they could take out the signal, they could disrupt the battle. That meant radio teams and wire layers were always in danger. The moment a soldier picked up a phone or adjusted an antenna, there was a good chance a sniper had them in their sights. And if it wasn't snipers, it was bombs. The cables that connected units had to be hidden, but that wasn't always possible. Laying them in open areas meant they were vulnerable to enemy artillery, and planes flying overhead would target any exposed lines. The same went for radio operators carrying large field radios. Those radios weren't just heavy. They were like carrying a giant bullseye on your back. Planes, tanks, and machine gunners all knew that taking out a radio team could throw an entire unit into confusion. Even when the enemy wasn't attacking directly, the job itself was exhausting and terrifying. Crawling through no man's land with a spool of wire, hoping not to be seen, was nerve-wracking. The moment the line was set up, it could be cut by enemy fire, forcing soldiers to go back out and fix it. There was no hiding from the dangers of this job, and there was almost no escaping it once you were chosen. Many didn't make it back. Next up on the row, kamikaze pilots turned themselves into deadly weapons, diving straight into enemy ships with no way back. Some jobs in World War II were dangerous. Then, there were jobs that were almost guaranteed to get you killed. And at the very top of that list was the kamikaze pilot. Unlike other soldiers who at least had a chance to make it home, these pilots signed up, knowing they would never return. Their mission was to fly their planes straight into enemy ships, turning themselves into human bombs. There was no escape, no backup plan, no hope of survival. Once they took off, they were flying towards certain death. The word kamikaze means divine wind in Japanese, and for the men chosen for these missions, it was seen as an honorable way to die. Surrendering was not an option in their culture. Dying for Japan was considered the ultimate sacrifice. Many young men volunteered, believing it was their duty, though others were pressured into it. Before their final flight, they would take part in a solemn ceremony, drinking sake and eating rice. Then they climbed into planes packed with explosives and just enough fuel to reach their target. Once in the air, there was no turning back. The strategy was brutally effective. Unlike regular bombs that could miss their mark, kamikaze attacks were almost guaranteed to hit. They sank dozens of warships and killed thousands of Allied sailors, striking fear into enemy fleets. But getting close enough to crash was not easy. American ships were heavily armed, and as soon as a kamikaze pilot was spotted, every gun on board opened fire. Many were shot down before they could reach their targets, exploding in mid-air or crashing into the ocean. But enough got through to cause massive destruction. The idea of suicide missions came as a desperate move when Japan realized it could no longer match American firepower. Their air force was struggling, their ships were being destroyed, and traditional attacks were failing. Kamikaze pilots were meant to turn the tide of the war, but in the end, it wasn't enough. Thousands of young men died, and Japan still lost. It was one of the deadliest, most terrifying jobs in history, one where the mission was not just to fight, but to die. While kamikaze pilots were struck with final attacks, combat engineers faced danger on the ground, clearing obstacles, building bridges, and defusing deadly traps under fire. Combat engineers had one of the most dangerous jobs in World War II. They were not just builders, they were fighters. bomb experts, and problem solvers in the middle of battle. Their job was to clear the way for soldiers, making sure nothing slowed them down. That meant blowing up enemy obstacles, clearing roads, building bridges, and even laying down mines to stop enemy attacks. But the enemy knew how important they were, which made them top targets. If you saw a combat engineer, you knew a big battle was about to happen. On D-Day, when soldiers stormed Omaha Beach, combat engineers were right there with them. Under heavy machine gun fire, they had to clear German defenses, destroy barbed wire, and make paths for the troops to escape the beach. Bullets were flying everywhere, and many engineers didn't make it out alive. In the freezing forests of the Battle of the Bulge, they had to fight as regular soldiers when the front lines collapsed. They even blew up a key bridge right in the face of advancing German forces, stopping their attack just in time. At the Ludendorff Bridge in Remagen, they helped American troops cross the Rhine River, knowing the bridge could collapse at any moment. 10 days later, it finally did, killing and injuring many engineers. They carried heavy explosives, set up dangerous traps, and had to work fast, while enemy snipers and artillery tried to take them out. If a mine didn't go off in their hands, a hidden sniper could be watching their every move. They had no choice but to keep going. Without them, soldiers couldn't move forward. Every victory came at a cost, and for combat engineers, that cost was often their own lives. Torpedo pilots flew low and fast over open water, dodging enemy fire to launch deadly strikes on warships. Knowing their chances of survival were slim, torpedo pilots had one of the most terrifying jobs in World War II. Their mission was simple: get close enough to enemy ships to fire a torpedo. But there was one huge problem. Torpedoes didn't have a long range, which meant these pilots had to fly dangerously low and straight at their target, making them an easy target for enemy guns. If they were lucky, they could drop the torpedo and escape. But luck wasn't always on their side. Many were shot down before they even had a chance to fire. Some militaries took this idea even further and decided to put a pilot inside a torpedo. The Germans built a machine called the Neger, where a pilot sat inside a small capsule on top of a torpedo. He would steer towards an enemy ship, guiding it right into position. When he was close enough, the lower torpedo would detach and speed ahead to strike the target. In theory, the pilot was supposed to steer away at the last second and escape the explosion. In reality, that almost never happened. Sometimes the torpedo wouldn't release, trapping the pilot in a deadly ride straight into the enemy. Other times, the explosion was too close, and the pilot never made it out. Even worse, some versions didn't even have a capsule. The pilot just sat on top, steering the weapon with his hands, and when the moment came, he had to jump into the water and hope for the best. Many didn't survive. Every mission was a gamble. Even if the pilot completed the attack, there was no guarantee he would make it back. Between enemy fire, malfunctioning weapons, and the sheer madness of riding a torpedo into battle, this job was nothing short of a death sentence. Snipers waited in silence, hidden for hours or even days, with a single shot deciding life or death from a distance. Snipers were some of the deadliest and most feared soldiers in World War II. Their job was to stay hidden, wait for the perfect shot, and take down enemy targets without being seen. It was a lonely, high-stress job. They didn't fight in big groups or charge into battle. Instead, they worked alone or in small teams, often staying in one spot for hours or even days. If they moved too soon or made a single mistake, they could give away their position and the enemy would hunt them down. Many armies quickly realized how useful snipers could be. At Dunkirk, Allied snipers slowed down the advancing Germans, buying time for their troops to escape. But the most famous sniper battles happened in Stalingrad. The city became a battleground for snipers on both sides, with the Soviets using their best marksmen to pick off German soldiers one by one. The intense sniper duels in the ruined city were brutal, and the Soviet success played a huge part in their victory. Despite their importance, most snipers didn't get special weapons. They used the same rifles as regular soldiers, just with better scopes to help them aim. Many of these guns were old models from World War I, slightly improved to work better in modern combat. But a good sniper didn't rely only on his rifle. He needed patience, nerves of steel, and perfect accuracy. Some snipers became legends, like Simo Haiha, Rosa Shanina, and Matthias Hetzenauer. They racked up hundreds of kills, striking fear into their enemies. But being a sniper wasn't just about skill. It was about surviving long enough to take the next shot, knowing that at any moment, another sniper could be watching, waiting to take you out first. Finally, stretcher bearers rushed into battle unarmed, braving bullets and explosions to carry the wounded to safety. Stretcher bearers had one of the toughest jobs in World War II. Their mission was simple: carry the wounded to safety. But nothing about it was easy. They had no weapons to defend themselves, no armor to protect them. All they had were their stretchers, their strength, and their determination. They ran straight into the chaos of battle, dodging bullets and explosions, knowing that at any moment they could be hit too. The battlefield was a nightmare. Thick mud, pouring rain, and bodies everywhere. Some soldiers had been lying wounded for days, too weak to call for help. Stretcher bearers had to find them, lift them onto heavy stretchers, and carry them back through gunfire and shelling. The deeper they went into the battlefield, the higher the risk. And the worst part, they had to come back again and again for the next wounded soldier, never knowing if this trip would be their last. Their job was physically exhausting. The stretchers were heavy, especially when moving through deep mud. The weight of a wounded soldier doubled when the ground sucked at their boots with every step. But the real challenge was mental. They had to ignore the screams of pain around them, stay focused, and push forward, even as bullets whizzed past their heads. Technically, the Geneva Convention protected them. In theory, enemies weren't supposed to shoot at them. In reality, the battlefield had no rules. Many stretcher bearers never made it back, yet they kept going because every trip meant saving a life. They were unarmed, defenseless, and constantly under fire. But without them, countless wounded soldiers would have been left to die where they fell. Well, that's all for today. War made life hard for everyone, but some jobs were the toughest of all. From dangerous bomb disposal to brutal factory work, these workers suffered the most. Their sacrifice should never be forgotten.